Principles of Microeconomics, Chapter 19, International Trade, Professor Wagner. This chapter is going to outline absolute and comparative advantages and what happens when a country has an absolute advantage in all goods, inter-industry trade between similar economies, and benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. Apple or Samsung iPhone. When you take a look at a smartphone, it consists of a great number of components, not all of which are created by Apple or Samsung. Matter of fact, they're made by chip manufacturers like Intel or NVIDIA and many others. And so it's comprised of a number of components that could have been manufactured by different companies in different locations, and then everything's brought together and assembled in one particular processing plant. So this is an example of this is an example of trade, and also international trade more specifically, and sometimes there's conflicts, in terms of intellectual property and the like. These are two terms you probably should know for the test. Absolute advantage is when a country can use fewer resources compared, to produce a good compared to another country, so they're simply more efficient. And as a result of being more efficient, they're more productive. Comparative advantage means that a country can produce a good at a lower cost in terms of other goods, meaning that they are particularly good at producing good A, but subsequent goods such as B or C maybe less so. We come back to production possibility frontiers before trade, and they use two comparisons. They use Saudi Arabia and the United States, and the two products are oil and corn bushels. So basically it's the opportunity cost of creating bushels of corn versus generating barrels of oil. So if Saudi Arabia focused completely on oil, they could produce 100 barrels of oil according to the graph, and 0 corn at point A. However, at point B, they could produce 25 bushels of corn and 0 oil. And it could also produce any other combination along that production frontier, and also anything inside the production frontier, which would mean that they are not effectively using all their resources. All points above the frontiers are impossible to produce given the current level of resources and technology. So that means that any combination that falls outside the line here is not possible. Anything along the line is possible. Anything inside this, beneath this line is possible. In continuation, if the United States only produced oil, it can produce 50 barrels at 0 corn at A, and then on the other extreme, 100 bushels of corn and no oil. Other combinations of both oil and corn are possible, such as production possibility C. Once again, anything underneath this curve is possible. Anything above it is not. So in terms of opportunity cost and comparative advantage, it's an illustration. The slope of the PPF illustrates the opportunity cost of producing oil in terms of corn. And so opportunity cost of producing oil in terms of corn is you get a quarter bushel for 1 unit of oil. Doesn't even really make much sense for them to do that. Opportunity cost of 1 unit corn in terms of oil, you can produce 4 barrels. And United States, they could produce, in terms of corn, 1 unit of oil in exchange of 2 bushels. However, the other way around, it would take a half a barrel of oil for them to produce, more corn. We recall the comparative advantage is the opportunity cost of producing goods, and so Saudi, and at least in terms of corn, it has comparative advantage in oil production. And really, when you think about it, it's a desert. I mean, it's a no-brainer. Yes, the oil is pretty much their sole product. The United States gives up in terms of oil produced bushel of corn, so has a comparative advantage of corn production where we have a tremendous amount of fertile land, and we have a very strong agro business, so it makes sense that we would be pretty good at producing crops such as corn. There is an interesting relationship between corn and oil anyways in terms of fuel. We could talk about that a little bit later. Gains from trade. So trade shows the PPF in Saudi after the trade. So if 20 units of oil are exported to the United States in exchange for 20 units of corn, the Saudi oil consumption is reduced by 20, but this enables Saudi to reach point D, and where the corn consumption is now increased to 30 instead of the former 10 over here. So they bought they bought the 20 bushels of corn in exchange for the oil, and so their consumption, for a little bit less production here, that they traded away, and they got this much here, and so maybe perhaps that made sense for that to happen. So a country can consume more than it produces as a result of specialization, and trade is what's really being illustrated here. So when a country has an absolute advantage in everything, this is something that will be typical for what we call high-income countries. And high-income countries are ones that are basically developed. They have technology, they have an industrial base, high levels of technology, and so they also tend to be more productive and efficient. And so these countries could probably produce all products with fewer resources than a low-income country, most certainly. Examples of these could be the United States. That's the one that comes to mind. But let's say France and Germany both have pretty total economies. They have agribusiness, they have technology, they have aircraft industry and the auto industry, and so does Germany. So these are all high-income countries that have an absolute advantage in pretty much everything. Even if all these countries have an absolute advantage in all products, trade might still be beneficial, and that's because the gains from trade from specializing on one's comparative advantage. So maybe one country does one thing better. Let's say maybe our agribusiness is maybe superior to that of, let's say, Germany in terms of output. So we would have a lot more agricultural products to trade, perhaps. And in relative terms, if there's an appetite for German automobiles here in the States, so people will, want those, or so there's a demand for that type of product. So that's something that Germany may feel it has a comparative advantage in, although how real that actually is, it's more perceived than real. There's mutually beneficial trade with comparative advantage. So with Forder workers, the United States can either produce 10,000 shoes and 0 refrigerators, or 40,000 refrigerator and 0 shoes. So when you think about the relative value of each product, we might decide to produce maybe perhaps more for refrigerators and shoes, unless you are talking about the production of Prada shoes, which might cost the same as a refrigerator, but that is an extreme example. So that's not the basis of a comparison. 40 workers can produce 8,000 shoes and 0 refrigerators in Mexico, or 10,000 refrigerators and 0 shoes. And so point A is where both countries start producing and consuming or trade, and point B is where they wind up after trade. So you once again see that you have a point outside the PPF, and if a country was simply producing for itself and not considering trade, then anything along this curve is fair game or underneath, but outside the curve it is not. So when countries trade, this enables them to consume more than they can produce because they get it from somebody else. So both countries have some level of consumption that's above the PPF. So this is considered mutually beneficial trade. So basically, the trade allows countries to take the advantage of the lower opportunity cost of the production of another country and maybe subsidize their efforts in something that they do particularly well. Gains from international trade on both sides results from pursuing comparative advantage and producing at a lower opportunity cost. Uh, we have 6 campers, and this is a comparative advantage illustration. And so let's say we have 6 people, and then one of them is very athletic, has been camping forever and a day, and very skilled in all aspects of things camping. Or one, she has an absolute advantage, but should she do all the work? And of course, common sense dictates no. This is a human nature thing. If everybody sits around and waits for her to do everything, not only should be an unhappy camper, there will be not much output for her group of friends to consume, meaning that she's likely to say, I'm going to go hunt my dinner, I'm going to cook my dinner, but it's my dinner. So everybody else will have to fend for themselves. So it's usually more beneficial that everybody finds a way to divide the labor. So they figure out where they may have some some variation of comparative advantage that where they can make a contribution. And so if everybody coordinates their efforts, everybody can be, well, let's say, happy campers. Intra-industry trade between similar economies. So the theory of comparative advantage trade should happen with a cut between economies with large difference in opportunity costs of production, but really roughly half the world trade of shipping goods between similar countries. So let's say Japan, Canada, the European Union, Japan, Mexico, and China, we all we have comparative advantage, maybe even absolute advantages in some cases. However, there are some benefit. There are benefits derived from trade, between these countries. Inter-industry trade between similar economies, the high proportion of it exists for 2 reasons. First off, the division of labor, learning, innovation, and unique skills, and then there's an economy scale argument. So gains from specialization and learning, working on very specific properties, requires countries to develop unique and different skills. And specialization in the world economy can be very finely split. Splitting up the value chain, many stages of producing a good happen in different geographic regions, such as, let's say, the iPhone or the Samsung phone. Many of the components are produced in various countries and everything brought together to produce the final product. And then value chain is how a good is produced in stages. And then you have economies of scale, competition, and variety. So concept of economies of scale is particularly relevant because it enables 1 or 2 large producers to supply the entire country. International trade, however, provides ways to combine the lower production costs that comes from economies of scale and still have competition and variety for consumers, meaning that they have, let's say, more than one product. Examples of industry and international trade where economy of scales are relevant. We can go for something that's really simple. Let's say beer. There's been a craft beer revolution in the United States where uh, we've decided that maybe importing, Belgian beer, which is some of the best in the world, is a good thing, but you really can't get enough of it. People like the flavor, they like the variety. People have grown tired of drinking Budweiser or Miller, and and there's maybe, let's say, a more upscale attitude about culinary things in general in the United States. That there's been a paradigm shift over the last couple decades. So we have the ability to create similar types of beers styles. And so, no, we're now on an age where not everybody's stuck drinking Budweiser, Miller, or Coors. And so we have, plenty of variety and competition from microbrewers. And so, economy of scale example, you see the curve. And so, at, so production plant S can produce 30, the cost at 30 units of quantities production at $30, M can produce, 50 at 20, and L can produce 10 at 150, and V can produce 200 at the same, same $10 number. And so if we were talking about toasters, production plant M can produce toasters even more cheaply than plant S because of economies of scale. However, you have L and V, they can produce more cheaply than S or M because of economies of scale. However, there's a diminishing return on this that plant V can go ahead and produce yet even more, but they're not able to do it at a cheaper rate. So once again, there's limits to economy of scale or an advantage of producing so much. The benefits of reducing barriers of trade, there are a number of factors that play into that. You'll hear the word tariff being flung around quite a bit lately, and it's a tax the governments place on imported goods. They're used simply as a political tool to protect, let's say, national interest in terms of economic, social, and cultural interest. And the WTO, or World Trade Organization, is committed to, let's say, promoting freer trade. And nations meeting through the WTO negotiate how they can reduce barriers to trade, such as tariffs. But let me say this, if you take a look at the news over the last several years, and even if you look back even longer than that, the WTO has done very little to open up, free trade. We have some agreements in place. However, the WTO itself has been very ineffective in negotiating what we would consider parity with other countries in terms of trade. Low-income countries benefit more from trade than high-income countries do, but there's 2 points you need to consider, and it's worth remembering that even a small gain is enough money to deserve attention, since this increase is not a one-time event and would persist year to year. Estimates may be on the low side because of some gains from trade not measured well in government, in economic statistics. So once again, this goes back to the concept of imperfect knowledge. We really just don't have a handle on just exactly what everything cost in relative terms of production of that quantity of product. So, it would be difficult to really measure the advantages of that sort of production or that sort of trade at times. End of chapter 19.